The wind howled like a wounded animal, a razor-sharp sound that sliced through the thin timber walls of the tiny frontier cabin. Snow didn't fall. It slammed against the shutters in angry white fists, trying to break in. Inside, the only sound was the ragged, shallow breath of a young woman hunched beside a dying fire, clutching two wailing newborns to her chest. Her name was Amelia, and she was alone. Her lips were cracked, her skin a ghostly pale from the grip of cold and a rising fever. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 3 days, swallowed by the very same storm that now clawed at their door. The supplies were gone. The hope was gone. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wood, sent a fresh spike of panic through her heart. Was it the wind, or was it wolves circling, smelling weakness? Then a new sound cut through the gale, a sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats, steady and heavy, crunching through the deep snow. They grew closer, closer, and then stopped right outside her door. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. The door creaked open. A figure stepped in, a giant wrapped in thick furs, blocking what little light remained. Snow dusted his hood, shadowing a face with eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a hawk's. He was a Comanche hunter, the people the settlers whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. But as he stood there, letting the cold pour in, Amelia had to ask herself a question that would decide everything. Was he her salvation, or was he something else entirely? Before we dive back into the heart of the storm, I want to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. And if this story is already pulling at your heartstrings, make sure you're subscribed, because what I have for you tomorrow is something truly special. You won't want to miss it. Now, let's get back to it. The Comanche hunter said nothing. He just stood there, a silent mountain in her doorway, the snow melting from his furs and pooling on the dirt floor. His eyes, dark and intense, flicked across the tiny, desperate room. They scanned her face, then the 2 wailing infants in her arms, then the pathetic, dying embers in the fire pit. The babies whimpered, their tiny cries swallowed by the vast, cold emptiness of the cabin. He took a single, deliberate step forward. His movements were fluid, silent, like a predator's. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He owned the space he was in. Amelia scrambled backward, her worn-out boots scraping against the floorboards. She pulled the twins tighter against her chest, a useless, fragile shield. Her voice, when it came out, was a trembling whisper. "Please. I have nothing to steal. We have nothing left." He didn't answer her plea. He didn't even seem to hear it. Instead, he moved past her, his presence both terrifying and strangely calming. He knelt beside the fire, his back to her, and pulled a small leather pouch from beneath his heavy robes. With a flick of his wrist, he sprinkled a pinch of dark, fragrant herbs into the embers. A sharp, clean scent filled the air, like pine needles and something wilder, something spicier. The flames didn't just flicker. They leaped up, roaring to life, casting the small cabin in a warm, dancing orange glow. The chill in the room began to retreat, if only for a moment. "I am not here to steal," he said at last. His voice was low and gravelly, weathered by wind and time. A thick accent marked his words, but his English was clear, devastatingly clear. He turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes finding hers in the firelight. "You are dying," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He gestured with his chin toward the infants. "All 3 of you." Amelia could only stare, her mind struggling to catch up. You speak English?" He gave a single, curt nod. "Enough to know you need help." It would be days before she learned his name was Takakota, which meant friend to all in his tongue. A bitter, ironic name for a man who seemed so alone, a scout and a hunter who had been exiled from his own band for reasons he refused to share. His arrival was a mystery wrapped in a blizzard. Why had he found them? Why now, at the very edge of their extinction? But there was no time for questions. That night, as the storm raged outside, pounding against the walls like a relentless beast, he worked without a moment's rest. He was a force of nature himself. He reinforced the flimsy door with fallen branches he'd carried in, creating a barrier against the wind. He boiled a strange, gnarled root into a bitter tea and made her drink, the warmth spreading through her veins and chasing away the fever's grip. He even used his own inner cloak, a soft, warm piece of rabbit fur, to rewrap the twins, Daniel and Ruth. Amelia watched him, a storm of suspicion and awe raging inside her. He moved with an innate grace, a man born of the wilderness, a man who understood its cruel language. Every motion was precise, purposeful. He chopped their last remaining piece of furniture, a broken chair, for firewood without asking. He patched a leak in the roof with mud and pine pitch. And he never, not once, asked for anything in return. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, began to flicker within her chest. But just as that tiny flame began to grow, danger didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it down. It happened 2 days later. The blizzard had broken, and a pale, ghostly light filtered through the trees, illuminating a world buried in white. Takakota had insisted she come outside, to get fresh air, to feel the sun on her skin. She was gathering brittle branches for the fire when she heard it. A distant shout. Not a cry for help. A hunting call. Then, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the silent woods. Before she could even react, Takakota was moving. He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and shoved her down behind the woodpile. "Stay down," he hissed, his eyes scanning the tree line. 3 riders burst from the woods, their horses churning up clouds of snow. They were rough men, their faces masked by scarves, their coats torn and ragged. They were outlaws, the kind who preyed on isolated settlers, the worst kind of human vultures. But then one of them shouted a single phrase that froze the blood in Amelia's veins. "There she is! Get her!" Amelia's world tilted. They weren't random. They weren't scavengers who had stumbled upon a lonely cabin. They had come specifically for her. In a blur of motion, Takakota had his bow in hand. An arrow was nocked, drawn, and loosed with a speed that seemed impossible. The air sang for a split second, and the lead rider screamed, a high, piercing sound, as the arrow buried itself in his thigh. He tumbled from his horse, thrashing in the snow like a wounded animal. The other 2 riders ducked behind the trees, firing their rifles blindly into the woods, the shots splintering the bark around them. Takakota turned to her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Run!" he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Take the children. Go out the back, now!" For once, she didn't hesitate. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raced back inside the cabin. She scooped up the twins, their small bodies a precious weight in her arms, and fled through the back door, disappearing into the dense, snow-choked forest. The cold air burned her lungs, and icy branches clawed at her face and shawl. Behind her, the world erupted in chaos. More gunfire, shouts, a man's scream cut short, and then a final, guttural yell. Then, silence. A deep, heavy silence that felt more terrifying than the noise. She waited in a thicket of brush, hidden, holding her breath, praying the babies wouldn't cry. Time stretched, becoming an eternity. When she finally dared to peek out from her hiding spot, a plume of thick black smoke was rising into the pale sky. Her cabin was in flames. "No, no, no," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Her home, the last piece of her old life, everything she had, gone, reduced to ash and smoke. She found Takakota an hour later, leaning against a tree, bleeding from a gash on his arm, exhausted, but alive. The bodies of the 3 outlaws lay still in the snow near the smoldering ruins of her home. He looked at her, his dark eyes grim. They wanted you, he said, his voice strained. They knew your name. They were not strangers. Amelia's legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the snow, the cold seeping through her thin dress, the truth crashing down on her with the weight of an avalanche. She knew. She knew who had sent them. Sheriff Cole Anders. The name tasted like poison in her mouth. Before she and Thomas had fled Virginia, she had worked as a clerk in a land registry office, a quiet, unassuming job. But one night, working late, she had discovered something. A series of forged land claims, meticulously crafted, transferring vast tracts of property into the hands of a single, shadowy investor. And the handwriting on the forgeries? It was familiar. It was Sheriff Anders's. She had tried to report it anonymously. The very next day, her employer vanished without a trace, and Sheriff Anders himself showed up at her door, his badge gleaming on his chest, a smile on his face that never reached his eyes, a smile that chilled her to the bone. "You're a smart girl, Amelia," he'd said, his voice smooth as silk. "Smart girls know when they haven't seen anything, and you don't want to see what happens to girls who see things they shouldn't." She and Thomas had packed their bags that night. They fled west, changed their names from Cartwright to Rhodes, and tried to bury their past under 1,000 miles of dirt and a dream of a new life. But the past had a long memory, and it had found her. She told Takakota everything, the words spilling out of her in a raw, broken torrent. He listened without speaking, his face as unreadable as a stone carving. "They won't stop," Amelia whispered, hot tears finally streaking her grimy cheeks, freezing in the cold air. "They'll just keep coming." Takakota looked from her face to the distant smoke still curling into the sky. His gaze was hard, his jaw set. "Then we go where they cannot follow." She looked down at the two tiny, innocent faces bundled in her arms. Then she looked at the exiled hunter, this strange, silent warrior who was now her only ally in this vast, cruel land. The wind had shifted. The danger was no longer just the storm or the wolves. It was a man with a badge and a grudge, a man with a long reach and no mercy. She gave a single, determined nod. "Where do we go?" Takakota didn't answer with words. He only held out his hand, his palm open, a silent invitation, a promise. That night, they vanished into the wilderness. A desperate mother, two helpless infants, and a warrior who belonged nowhere. But somewhere behind them, in the smoldering ashes of their shared past, Sheriff Anders was already saddling his horse. And this time, he wasn't sending his dogs. He was coming himself. The forest was a merciless, endless maze of white and gray. Each tree stood as a silent, skeletal witness to their desperate flight. Amelia's legs, already weak from hunger and childbirth, trembled with every agonizing step through the waist-deep snow. Her arms ached with a deep burning pain from clutching the twins, their combined weight a constant precious burden against her chest. Behind her, Takakota moved like a ghost. He was a shadow gliding over the snow, his presence so silent she often had to turn to make sure he was still there. He carried nothing but his bow, a quiver of arrows, and a single, sharp blade at his hip. He was the wilderness personified, and she was a fragile city bird cast into its heart. For days, they trudged onward. Their world shrank to the rhythm of survival. Walk, rest, feed the babies, walk again. They followed frozen riverbeds to avoid leaving tracks, scaled treacherous, ice-covered ridges that tore at Amelia's worn-out shoes, and crossed barren, wind-swept plains so vast and empty, it felt like they had fallen off the edge of the world. Takakota never spoke of the cold, the hunger, or the exhaustion. He was a creature of stone and will. He hunted what little game could be found in the desolate landscape, a snowshoe hare here, a frozen squirrel there. He showed her which roots to dig for beneath the frost, roots that were bitter and tough but kept starvation at bay. Amelia did her part. She tended to the twins, her movements slow and mechanical. She melted snow for water. She repaired their clothes with clumsy stitches, but each breath was a battle against the searing cold in her lungs. Her hands, once soft, were now covered in blisters and raw, bleeding cracks. Sleep was a stolen luxury, snatched in fitful, terrifying bursts between the baby's cries and the ever-present fear that they were being followed. They spoke very little, but when they did, the words carried weight. "Why are you helping me?" she asked him one night. They were huddled close to a small, nearly smokeless fire he had built in the shelter of a rock outcropping. The twins were asleep for once, nestled in a makeshift bed of pine boughs between them. Takakota stared into the flames, his chiseled face illuminated by the flickering light. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "I have seen too many people left behind in the snow," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her, but his words hung in the air, heavy with a history she couldn't begin to understand. "No more." Amelia didn't press him, but she saw it then. A flicker of deep, old pain in his eyes. He wasn't just running from the sheriff's men, he was running from something inside himself. By the 7th day, their luck had run out. The last of the rabbit meat was gone. A new storm was brewing, the wind whipping through the trees with a low, mournful howl. And the babies had started to cough, a dry, rasping sound that seized Amelia's heart with icy dread every time she heard it. Their tiny bodies were failing. Just as despair threatened to consume her, they saw it. Perched on a high hill, half buried in snow, was an old, abandoned mission. It was a ruin, a skeleton of a building with crumbling stone walls and a sagging roof. But it was shelter. It was a chance. They stumbled inside, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and relief. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the broken roof, but the thick stone walls held back the worst of the wind. That night, as the new blizzard buried the world in white once more, Takakota laid a gentle hand on Amelia's shoulder. His touch was hesitant, almost surprising. "I must go hunt," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Find medicine for the children's cough." Amelia's head snapped up. She froze, the blood draining from her face. "You're leaving? You're leaving us here? Alone?" He met her terrified gaze, his own eyes dark and serious. "Do you want them to live? Then I must go. The herbs I need do not grow on this rock." He looked toward the door, his jaw tight with resolve. "I will be back before the sun rises twice." He left without another word. She watched from the doorway as his figure became a small, dark speck against the swirling white. And then he was gone. The crushing weight of her solitude slammed back down on her. The mission, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now seemed like a tomb. The shadows in the corners grew longer, deeper. Every creak of the old wooden beams, every sigh of the wind through the cracks, made her flinch. She held the twins close, their coughing fits growing more frequent, and sang them the same lullabies her mother had once sung to her. Her voice was thin and reedy, a fragile thread of warmth in the vast, cold dark. And that's when she heard it. A knock, a soft, deliberate knock on the heavy wooden door. She froze solid, her song dying in her throat. Her hand instinctively reached for the small, sharp skinning knife Takakota had given her. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Another knock. Louder this time, more insistent. Then, before she could decide what to do, the door creaked open with a low groan. It wasn't Takakota. The man who stepped into the ruined chapel was tall and unnervingly pale. He wore the tattered gray coat of a Confederate soldier, a ghost from a war that had supposedly ended years ago. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, and a jagged white scar split his upper lip, giving him a permanent sneer. He didn't speak. He just stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding on the stone floor, shaking snow from his coat. "Who are you?" Amelia demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. She stood up, placing herself between the stranger and her children. He didn't answer. He just looked at the twins, his cold eyes lingering on them for a moment too long, and then his gaze shifted back to her. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. But before he could take another step, a new voice rang out from the darkness behind him, a voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "She asked you a question." Takakota. He was back. He stood in the doorway he had just entered, an arrow nocked in his bow, the point aimed directly at the stranger's throat. The pale man raised his hands slowly, that eerie smile never leaving his face. "Easy now, friend. I'm just a traveler. Saw the light from your fire, looking for shelter from the storm." Takakota didn't lower his bow. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were deadly. "You walked through a blizzard, up a desolate hill, to a ruined church in the middle of nowhere, just for shelter?" The man's smile widened. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and mocking, "you did." A tense, heavy silence stretched between the two men. Finally, Takakota motioned with the tip of his bow. "Leave." The man held his gaze for another long second, then backed out slowly, never turning his back. He melted back into the swirling snow as if he had never been there. As soon as he was gone, Takakota kicked the door shut and barred it with a heavy fallen beam. He turned to Amelia, his face grim. "He was a scout," he said, his voice low. "Sheriff's man. He will return. With others." They were on the move again before the false dawn painted the sky in shades of gray. The blizzard had calmed, but the danger had only intensified. Takakota led them down from the hills, through a narrow, rocky canyon where the walls rose high on either side, hoping the terrain would hide their trail. Amelia followed, her fear now a growing, sickening dread. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being expertly tracked. And then they found the signs. Hoofprints in a sheltered patch of snow too fresh to be old, the faint smell of ash from a recently doused fire, and then, caught on a thorny bush, a small torn piece of blue cloth. Amelia's stomach turned to ice. She recognized it instantly. It was a piece of the swaddling blanket she had wrapped Daniel in just days before. "He is close," Takakota said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. "He wants you alive, but he will kill me to get to you." Amelia stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to face him, the question she'd been holding back finally spilling out. "Why? Why do you care what happens to me? You barely know me. You could leave me right now and be free." Takakota paused, his back to her. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with a pain that was almost palpable. "Because once before, I failed to protect someone, and I watched them die because of it." It was the first real crack in his armor of stone, a glimpse of the man beneath the warrior. They pressed on, the revelation hanging between them. Amelia began to see him differently. He wasn't just a stoic survivalist. He was a man burdened by ghosts, a man trying to atone for a past he couldn't outrun. She watched how he would instinctively reach out to steady her on a slippery patch of ice. She saw how he would hum a low, rumbling tune to calm the babies when her own lullabies failed. She noticed how he always slept with one eye open, his body positioned between her and the darkness, a silent guardian. And in those quiet, unguarded moments, she saw something else flicker in his eyes, something deeply human, something kind. But trust was a fragile seed in this frozen wasteland, and it needed more time to grow than they had. Their last hope was a ridge overlooking a narrow, hidden valley. Takakota had told her an old ally of his, a Comanche elder, had a winter lodge there. It was a place of sanctuary, a place they could finally rest. But when they finally crested the ridge, their hearts sank. Below them, the lodge was a ruin. It had been burned to the ground. Blackened timbers lay scattered like broken bones. Charred furs and shattered pottery littered the snow. The acrid smell of smoke and destruction still hung heavy in the cold, still air. Takakota slid down the embankment and knelt in the ashes. He touched the charred wood, his face a mask of grief and fury. He whispered something in his native tongue, a prayer or a curse. Amelia couldn't tell. He stood up, his eyes meeting hers across the desolate scene. The last of his hope seemed to have died in those flames. "It was him," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Anders. The sheriff was here." Amelia felt the noose tightening, the world closing in. They had nowhere left to run, no allies left to turn to, no sanctuary left in this God-forsaken land. And in that moment of utter despair, a chilling realization struck her. It wasn't just about silencing her anymore. It was bigger than that. "He doesn't just want me dead," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He wants the land." Takakota looked at her, his expression confused. Amelia's hands trembled as she reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her cloak. She pulled out a small oilskin pouch. She hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Thomas. Inside was a folded piece of parchment. It was old, the ink faded, but the lines were unmistakable. It was a map. "My father," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "He was a surveyor for the territories. Before he died, he gave this to me. He said it was my inheritance, my security." She unfolded it, her finger tracing a series of faint lines. "It marks a hidden spring, a source of fresh water deep beneath these hills, the only one for 100 miles in any direction." She looked up at Takakota, her eyes wide with the terrible weight of her knowledge. "Whoever controls this spring, they control everything, the water, the trade routes, the future of this entire valley." Takakota stared at the map, then at her, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You had this all along?" "I didn't think it mattered," she whispered, shame and fear warring within her. "I thought it was just a piece of paper. Not until now. Now everything made a horrible, perfect sense. The sheriff's obsession, the bounty hunters, the burned-out lodge. He didn't just want revenge for his foiled land scheme. He wanted absolute power. And Amelia wasn't just a witness to be silenced. She was the key. Takakota's face hardened, his eyes turning to flint. "Then he will never stop," he said, his voice a low, dark promise. "Not until he holds this map in his hands and your blood is on the ground." They made one last desperate camp that night in a shallow cave carved high into the cliffs above the valley. As the fire flickered low and the twins slept fitfully between them, Amelia looked at Takakota, the man who had become her entire world. "You could leave," she said softly, the words costing her more than she cared to admit. "You don't owe me this. You could disappear into the mountains, and he would never find you." He met her gaze across the fire, and for a long, aching time, he said nothing. The only sound was the wind and the crackling flames. Then, quietly, he spoke. "I stay because I choose to." For the first time, driven by an impulse she didn't understand, Amelia reached across the small fire and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move closer either. The moment hung between them, unspoken, fragile, and utterly unfinished. And then they saw it. Below them, in the inky darkness of the valley floor, a series of lights appeared. Torches, moving like angry fireflies through the trees. They were organized. They were spreading out. They were coming up the cliffs. Sheriff Anders had found them, and there was no more time to run. The wind didn't just howl through the mouth of the cave. It screamed, a high, piercing shriek that flung stinging pellets of snow into their small fire, making it hiss and sputter. Amelia clutched the map, her knuckles white, her eyes locked on the faded ink lines her father had so carefully drawn decades ago. It felt impossibly heavy in her hands, the weight of a kingdom. Takakota knelt beside her, his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied the parchment in the flickering firelight. His finger, calloused and scarred, traced a path that she had never noticed before. "It is more than a spring," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the storm. He pointed to a series of subtle markings near the water source. "These symbols, they are old, my people's symbols. This is a sacred valley. These are burial grounds." He paused, his eyes lifting to meet hers, dark with a dawning horror. "And this line here, this is not a rock formation. It is a vein, silver. A massive, untouched silver deposit running directly beneath the sacred burial sites of his ancestors. The sheriff didn't just want water. He wanted to desecrate hallowed ground for a fortune." The revelation was sickening. Amelia nodded slowly, the full monstrous scope of Anders's greed finally crashing down on her. "That's why he wants me dead, and why he needs this map to do it." A heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fears. But then Takakota added, almost to himself, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear it. "And it is why your husband's death was not an accident." Amelia's head snapped toward him, her heart giving a painful lurch. "What are you talking about?" Takakota's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I have been thinking. You said he went for supplies and never returned, that he fell from a ridge." "Yes," she whispered. The story she had been told, the story she had clung to, feeling suddenly flimsy and thin. "That's what I was told." "By who?" Takakota pressed, his voice gentle but firm. Her own voice faltered. The foreman from the settlement, the one who found his body. He said Thomas must have slipped on the ice." Takakota's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "I have passed that ridge. It is narrow, treacherous. The trail is too dangerous for a horse. Only a man on foot, a man who knows the land, can cross it safely." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "What if he did not fall?" he asked softly. "What if he was pushed?" Amelia's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Why would someone—" She stopped, the question dying on her lips, because she knew the answer. The terrible, simple answer. Because Thomas knew about the map. Maybe he had finally understood its true value. Maybe he had confronted someone. Maybe, in his good-hearted naivety, he had trusted the wrong person. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Thomas hadn't died by accident. He had been silenced, just as they were trying to silence her. She collapsed back against the cold stone of the cave wall, a dry, ragged sob tearing from her throat. "He knew," she choked out. "He knew the danger, and he never told me." Takakota crouched beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the swirling chaos of her grief. "He was trying to protect you," he said, his voice firm. "He just ran out of time." Amelia looked up at him, the raw grief in her eyes slowly hardening into something else, something cold and sharp. Resolve. "Then I will not run anymore," she declared. Takakota gave a single, solemn nod. But just as that new, steely determination settled in her chest, a faint sound echoed from the mouth of the cave, a crunch of snow, the scrape of a boot on rock. Instantly, Takakota was on his feet, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked. He moved in front of her, a silent, deadly shield. "Stay behind me." But it wasn't Sheriff Anders who appeared at the cave's entrance, silhouetted against the raging storm. It was the pale, Confederate-coated man from the abandoned mission. And this time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both heavily armed. One had a brutal, scarred face, his nose crooked as if it had been broken many times. The other was just a boy, barely old enough to grow a beard, but his eyes burned with a cold, dead hatred that was ancient. "We were hoping you'd lead us up here," the leader said, his scarred lip twisting into a sneer. "Saves us the trouble of tracking you in the valley. Makes things much cleaner." Amelia clutched the twins, her body trembling, but her mind was strangely clear. Takakota stepped forward, his bow held steady. "Who are you?" The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Names don't matter much out here on the edge of the world. Let's just say we're business associates of the sheriff." "Bounty hunters," Takakota muttered, the word a curse. "You got it," the leader confirmed. He tilted his head, his cold eyes fixing on Amelia. "And you, Missy, you turned out to be worth a whole lot more than we first thought. Turns out, there's a buyer back east, a railroad company. They're willing to pay double what the sheriff offered to get that little piece of paper back." Takakota's grip on his bow tightened, his knuckles turning white. But then, from the shadows just behind the bounty hunters, a fourth figure stepped into the light. A woman, wrapped in furs, a rifle slung over her shoulder. Her blonde hair was matted with snow, whipping around a face that Amelia knew all too well. Amelia blinked, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. It was Claire, the midwife from the nearby settlement, the kind, gentle woman who had helped deliver her twins, the woman who had held her hand and told her she was strong. A friend. Claire offered her a soft, sad smile, but there was a bitter, poisoned edge to it. "I told you to leave, Amelia," she said, her voice laced with a strange, chilling pity. "I warned you after Thomas died, but you wouldn't listen. You stayed here, clinging to a dream that was never yours to have." Amelia struggled to her feet, her own voice shaking with disbelief and betrayal. "Claire, you helped them? You led them to me?" Claire's face darkened, the pity replaced by a cold, hard fanaticism. "My family worked this land for 50 years before you people came with your fences and your laws. Your father's map would have handed it all over to city men with gold teeth and inked paper. You think I'd let that happen? This land needs to be cleansed." "You delivered my children," Amelia whispered, the words like shards of glass in her throat. Claire's eyes flicked to the two swaddled infants in Amelia's arms, and for a second, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed her face. "Yes," she said softly, "which makes this all so much harder." Takakota stepped between them, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You will not touch her." The bounty hunter leader laughed and raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Takakota's heart. "I really suggest you move, friend." But Takakota was faster, so fast it was hard to follow. In one fluid, impossible motion, he sidestepped and loosed his arrow. It flew true, striking the scar-faced man in the shoulder with a sickening thud. The cave exploded into a nightmare of sound and light. Gunfire erupted, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. Claire screamed and dove for cover behind a large rock. Takakota shoved Amelia back, deeper into the darkness of the cave. "Go!" he yelled over the chaos. "There's a tunnel at the back. Take the babies. Take the map. I will draw them away." "No!" she cried, reaching for him. "Not alone!" But he didn't argue. He just gave her one last intense look, a look that said everything they had never had the time or the words to say. A look that promised, that mourned, that burned with a fierce, protective fire. Then he turned and vanished back into the storm of gunfire at the cave's entrance. Amelia ran. She scrambled through the narrow, dark tunnel at the back of the cave, clutching her children, her heart hammering in her throat. Behind her she heard the echoes of gunshots, the shouts of angry men, and the defiant war cry of a lone warrior. A voice she wasn't sure she would ever hear again. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, until the trees and the swirling snow swallowed her whole. She collapsed at the base of an ancient, gnarled cedar, gasping for air, her babies crying softly against her chest. And that's when she noticed it. She frantically searched her pockets, the sling holding the twins. Her heart stopped. The map was gone. It wasn't in her coat. It wasn't in the sling. It was gone. He hadn't just told her to take it. In the chaos, in that final, desperate moment, Takakota had taken it from her, not to protect the map, but to protect her, to make himself the primary target. And now he was out there, alone, facing a small army of killers, armed with nothing but a bow and a stolen piece of parchment that held the future of the entire valley. And as the snow fell harder, burying the world in a silent white grave, she had no idea if he would survive the night. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, a curtain of white that erased the world. The valley was a churning cauldron of wind and ice, as if the sky itself had ruptured and was bleeding out. Amelia stumbled through the drifts, her babies strapped tightly to her chest, their small, warm bodies the only anchor in the swirling chaos. Every breath was a burning stab in her lungs, every step a monumental effort of will. Her mind was a maelstrom, reeling with one single agonizing thought. Takakota was gone. He had the map. He had made himself the target. And now, everything, her life, her children's lives, his life, depended on whether he was still breathing. But she couldn't go back. Not now. Not with the twins. To go back would be to undo his sacrifice. All she could do was push forward, to find shelter, to keep her children alive. It was the only way his sacrifice could mean anything. She found it by sheer dumb luck. An old, abandoned miner's shack, tucked against the sheer face of a cliff, almost completely buried in a snowdrift. The roof sagged dangerously, and the walls moaned with every gust of wind. But it was shelter. It was 4 walls and a chance to live through the night. Inside, she laid the babies down on a dusty cot, wrapping them in the last of her dry blankets. She used the last of her flint and steel to start a small, sputtering fire in the rusty iron stove, feeding it slivers of wood she stripped from a broken table leg. She stared into the weak, flickering flames, her mind numb, her body screaming with exhaustion. She wanted to weep, to scream, to shatter into a million pieces. But there was no time. There was no luxury left for weakness. And then, through the shriek of the storm, came the sound of hoofbeats. Amelia's head snapped up. She grabbed the small skinning knife Takakota had left with her, her hand slick with sweat despite the cold. Her body began to shake uncontrollably. They had found her. It was over. The shack's door creaked open, groaning in protest. But it wasn't a bounty hunter. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Elias, Thomas's younger brother. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the white storm, brushing snow from his shoulders. His face was thinner than she remembered, haggard and worn, but it was him. His eyes, however, were different. They had gone hard and glassy, like chips of frozen river ice. Amelia scrambled to her feet, instinctively placing her body between him and the cot where the babies lay. "Elias?" she gasped. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Kansas." Elias didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of comfort. "Got a letter," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Heard what happened to Thomas. Came as fast as I could." "You came all this way? For family?" A tiny, treacherous flicker of hope ignited in her chest. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, but there was something cold and dead behind his gaze. "Not quite," he said. He reached into his coat and tossed something onto the dirt floor between them. It was a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper, a telegram. Amelia's eyes darted down to the printed words. They were stark, brutal, and clear. "Amelia holds the map. Comanche won't leave her. Take it. Burn the rest. Anders." Her blood ran cold, turning to slush in her veins. She looked up at Elias, her mind refusing, unable to comprehend the depth of this new betrayal. Elias just shrugged, a casual, almost bored gesture. "It's nothing personal, Amelia. Just business. You know, Thomas was always the sentimental one. Never understood what the land was really worth." She was too stunned to speak, to move. Her world had just shattered. Again. He glanced over at the cot, at the 2 sleeping infants, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, regret, pain, something almost human, crossed his face. I didn't expect them to look so much like him, he murmured. That was what broke the spell. Amelia lunged forward, the knife held tight in her hand. You touched them, she snarled, her voice a low, vicious thing she didn't recognize. And I will bury this blade in your throat. Elias actually smirked. Still got that fire in you. Shame. It'll burn out soon enough out here. He reached for the rifle slung over his back, but before his fingers could close around the stock, a deafening crack split the air. The entire back wall of the shack exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood and snow. A dark figure surged through the breach, a whirlwind of fury and motion. It was Takakota. His blade flashed in the dim light. Elias stumbled back, his face a mask of pure shock. Amelia screamed, grabbing the twins and dropping to the floor as the two men collided with the force of a landslide. Elias fired his rifle blindly, the shot going wide, sparking off the stone hearth. But Takakota was on him. A silent, vengeful specter. He was faster, stronger. He slammed Elias into the opposite wall, the impact rattling the entire shack. The rifle clattered to the floor, useless. Takakota held Elias by the collar of his coat, lifting him off his feet, his eyes wild with a righteous fury. You betrayed your own blood, he roared. Elias coughed, a sneer twisting his lips. Blood doesn't matter out here, he spat. Only land does. With a final guttural cry of rage, Takakota drove his fist into Elias's face. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Elias went limp, slumping to the floor in an unconscious heap. Takakota turned to Amelia, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Snow clung to his torn coat, and a dark, crimson stain was spreading across his side. You're hurt, she gasped, scrambling to her feet. I'll live, he grunted, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She looked at him, really looked at him. His hair was matted with snow and blood. His face was scraped raw from wind and branches. He was wounded, exhausted, on the brink of collapse. And yet, he had come back for her. He had fought through a storm and a pack of killers to return to her side. She reached out and gently touched his arm. I thought you were dead, she whispered. He stared at her for a long moment, the sounds of the storm and their ragged breathing filling the small space. I was, he said, his voice raw, until I met you. But there was no time for tenderness, no time for the 1,000 things that hung unsaid between them. Footsteps, outside, dozens of them, the crunch of boots on ice, the sound of horses neighing, the low murmur of men's voices growing louder, surrounding the shack. Sheriff Cole Anders had found them. Takakota pulled the crumpled map from inside his coat. His eyes met Amelia's, and in them she saw a terrible, final resolve. We end this now, he said. On our terms. He led her out of the shack and up the cliff face, to the very ridge where Thomas had died. It was a narrow, wind-swept path leading to a flat ledge that overlooked the entire valley. There, in the heart of the howling storm, Takakota spread the map on a flat rock, lit a torch he'd taken from the shack, and held it high. Within minutes, Anders and his posse of a dozen men appeared on the valley floor below, their faces turned up toward the light. Anders! Takakota's voice boomed, carried by the wind. Give me the girl and the map! The sheriff roared back, his voice thin and sharp. And I might let the savage live! Takakota didn't answer. He simply lowered the torch until it was inches from the precious parchment. One step closer, he yelled, and the whole damn future of this valley burns with it. Anders snarled, his face contorted with rage. You won't do it. That map is your only ticket to survival. But then Amelia stepped forward, to the very edge of the cliff, her small figure defiant against the raging storm. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper of fear, but a blade of pure, cold fury that cut through the wind. You killed my husband for this paper! She screamed down at him. You sent your dogs to hunt me and my babies! You burned homes, you betrayed friends, you turned brother against brother. Anders just grinned up at her, a wide, predatory smile. And I'd do it all again, sweetheart. You think the government down in Austin gives a damn about a half-dead widow and her savage pet? This is my valley now! Takakota's hand trembled, the weight of the decision shaking him. But it was Amelia who reached out and took the torch from his grasp. She looked at Anders, her eyes burning with a fire fiercer than the flame she held. You will never own this land, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, and she touched the torch to the map. Flames licked hungrily at the dry edges of the parchment. Anders screamed, a raw, inhuman sound of pure rage and disbelief. No! Amelia's eyes burned, not with grief, but with a terrible, righteous purpose. She dropped the torch. The map ignited, curling into a black, brittle husk, the secrets of the valley turning to ash and smoke, carried away on the wind. Below, chaos erupted. Men shouted, pushed, and scrambled, trying to find a way up the treacherous cliff path. Takakota turned to her, his face grim. They're coming. She nodded, tears of loss and liberation streaming down her face. Then we make our stand. They positioned themselves among the rocks and fallen trees at the top of the narrow path. Takakota, with a grim efficiency, knocked arrow after arrow. Amelia, her hands shaking but her will firm, loaded Elias's rifle. The first wave of men came fast, 3 of them charging up the icy path. Takakota dropped 2 with clean, silent shots before they even reached the halfway mark. Amelia sighted down the barrel of the rifle, squeezed the trigger, and took down the 3rd. The gun kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound deafening, but she didn't flinch. She loaded it again. More men came. The battle for the ridge blurred into a hellish symphony of chaos. Gunfire, shouts, the whistle of arrows, the sting of smoke in the air. Takakota fought like a phantom, a swift and brutal ghost in the swirling snow, but he was bleeding heavily, slowing down. Amelia reloaded and fired, until her hands were raw and her ears were ringing. Then, another shot rang out, closer this time. Takakota staggered. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and dropped to his knees, his bow clattering against the rocks. Blood poured from a fresh wound in his side. Sheriff Anders appeared at the top of the path behind him, his own pistol smoking, a triumphant, demonic grin plastered on his face. Should have stayed out of white men's business, boy, he sneered. Amelia screamed his name and aimed her rifle, pulling the trigger. Click, empty. Anders laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. He raised his revolver, taking slow, deliberate aim, not at her, but at the swaddled babies she had placed in a sheltered nook behind a rock. But before he could fire, a final whispered thwip cut through the air. An arrow, black-fletched and deadly, buried itself deep in the sheriff's throat. He froze. His eyes went wide with shock and surprise. A gurgling sound escaped his lips as he dropped his pistol and clawed at his neck. Then he pitched forward, falling face first into the snow, dead. Takakota, still on his knees, his body trembling with the last of his strength, slowly lowered his bow. Amelia scrambled to his side, collapsing beside him. Takakota, stay with me, please, stay with me. His voice was a faint, ragged whisper. Did we win? She nodded, sobbing, cradling his head in her lap. Yes, we won. You saved us. A weak smile touched his lips. Then, that is enough. And his eyes began to close. No, she whispered, her heart shattering. No, you don't get to leave me now. Not now. But just as his last breath seemed to leave him, the wind shifted, and with it came a new sound, hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Out of the trees at the base of the cliff, a war party of Comanche riders emerged, their painted faces grim, their weapons ready. One of them, an old woman with eyes as sharp as Takakota's, dismounted and scaled the cliff path with an agility that defied her age. She knelt beside him, placing her fingers on his neck. He is still breathing, she said, her voice stern. Barely. We will take him. Amelia looked at the innocent faces of her babies, then at the dying man in her arms, and then at the warriors who had appeared like spirits from the storm. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Not if she had anything to say about it. And so, with nothing left but a fierce, desperate love, a legacy of blood, and a future that had just been burned to ashes, they descended from the ridge and vanished back into the snow. The storm had finally broken. A fragile, golden morning light crept over the valley, casting long shadows across the blood-stained snow on the ridge. The world was quiet, draped in a heavy, final silence. Where the map had burned, a black circle of ash was the only scar on the pristine white landscape. Amelia paced restlessly outside the large, hide-covered medicine lodge. The air was still and cold, biting at her cheeks. Inside, Takakota lay suspended between worlds. He had been unconscious for hours, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The Comanche healers, led by the stern old woman she now knew was his aunt, worked tirelessly. They had cleaned and packed the deep wound in his side with a poultice of herbs and sung low, chanting prayers to the spirits of the wind and earth. But his pulse remained weak, his breathing a shallow, almost imperceptible flutter. Nothing was certain. Amelia clutched her children, Daniel and Ruth, who were blessedly quiet in her arms. She stared at the closed flap of the lodge, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. I should have stopped him, she whispered to the wind, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I should have never let him become the target. This is my fault. Just then, the flap of the lodge opened, and Takakota's aunt, Shima, emerged, her face etched with exhaustion. He fights still, she said, her low voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. But he is not only fighting death, he is fighting himself. Amelia blinked, her mind foggy with grief and lack of sleep. What do you mean? Shima's eyes, as sharp and dark as obsidian, fixed on her. He carries more than wounds of the body. There is a deep wound in his spirit, a grief that has never healed, a brother he feels he betrayed, a tribe that questioned his loyalty. His spirit is tired. He must choose now whether he wants to live or to finally fade. The old woman's words struck Amelia like a physical blow. Her heart cracked open. She knew what Shima was talking about. Takakota had told her once, in a rare, unguarded moment of shared darkness by a dying fire. My younger brother walked into a white man's town to negotiate a peace treaty. He carried a white flag. He never came back. They said he started a fight. They sent me to find his body, but they had already buried him in an unmarked grave. Not one of them would even tell me his name. She had seen the guilt that haunted his eyes, the silent, crushing shame he carried for not being there, for failing to protect the one person he was sworn to. Now, that same ghost was pulling him under, and she couldn't let it happen. She wouldn't. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she handed the twins to a young Comanche woman who stood nearby and stepped into the dim, smoky interior of the lodge. Takakota lay on a bed of soft furs, his face pale and still, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, ragged effort. The air smelled of sage and blood. Amelia knelt beside him. She took his cold, limp hand in hers and pressed her forehead against his. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Do you hear me, Takakota? You don't get to do this." There was no response, just the faint, shuddering breath. She closed her eyes, gathering all the strength she had left. "I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to tell you that the pain of what you lost will ever go away. I won't promise you peace or forgiveness, because those things aren't mine to give." She paused, her own voice shaking with the force of her emotions. "But I will promise you this. If you stay, if you fight, we will build something new from these ashes. Together, we will make every person in this valley remember your brother's name. We will raise these children to speak truth, to walk with honor, to know the story of the man who saved them. Her grip on his hand tightened. And if you still need to be angry, then be angry with me, yell at me, hate me, but don't you leave, because I am not brave without you. I never was. A long, agonizing silence filled the lodge. The only sound was the soft crackle of the ceremonial fire. Then, a breath, deeper than before, stronger. Takakota's fingers twitched against hers. His eyes fluttered open. They were weak, clouded with pain, but they were clear. They were focused on her. A faint, crooked smile touched his cracked lips. You talk too much, he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. Amelia laughed, a choked, sobbing sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead. You stubborn, beautiful fool. He smiled again, a genuine, albeit weak, smile. Did we win? She squeezed his hand, her heart feeling like it might burst. You came back to me, she whispered. That's all the winning I need. He held her gaze, and for a moment, the fire was back in his eyes. Not done yet, he whispered. 2 weeks later, the valley was transformed. The great melt had come, and without the blanketing snow, the land showed its scars. Burned trees, shattered trails, graves newly marked with stones, but it also showed signs of life. Patches of vibrant green grass pushed through the mud. Wild flowers in defiant shades of purple and yellow began to bloom. Amelia stood atop the ridge, the same ridge where she had made her stand. This time, the twins were not in her arms, but on a blanket at her feet, and Takakota stood beside her. He leaned on a carved walking stick, but he was on his own 2 feet. Below them, in the meadow, an impossible sight was unfolding. A gathering of settlers and a council of Comanche elders, sitting together. It was the first peace meeting of its kind. It hadn't been easy. It had taken days of tense negotiations, with messages carried back and forth by Takakota's friends, letters carefully written by Amelia, and the shared, looming threat of what would happen if they couldn't settle their differences. The land would be claimed by faceless, outside forces who cared for neither of them. But it was happening. She stepped forward to speak, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the quiet crowd. My name is Amelia Cartwright. This land, it nearly broke me. It took my husband. It almost took my children. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the settlers, then the Comanche. But it gave me something too. It gave me truth. She looked directly at the settlers. This land was never ours to take. Then she turned to the Comanche. But it can be ours to share. We can protect it together, or we will all lose it to those who care only for the silver in the ground and the timber on the hills. She held up a new map. Not the original, but a copy drawn by hand, a collaboration between her, Takakota, and the elders. This is no longer a map of ownership, she declared. It is a map of home. A murmur went through the crowd. One of the Comanche elders, a tall, dignified man with braids of pure silver, stood up and gave a single, solemn nod. Then let it begin. And so it did. Later that night, Takakota sat by a large bonfire, his legs still weak, but his spirit visibly lighter than it had been in years. Amelia approached quietly, the twins now asleep on a fur-lined cradleboard on her back. You kept your promise, he said, looking up at her. You made them remember his name. They will name the river after him. So did you, she replied softly. She sat beside him, the warmth of the fire a welcome comfort. They stared into the dancing flames for a long time. Do you ever think about leaving? She asked him. Starting over somewhere new? Somewhere without all these ghosts? He shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. This is my brother's land, my father's land. He turned to look at her, a serious expression on his face. It is your land, our land now. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then he spoke again, his voice low and hesitant. Amelia, there is one more truth I must tell you. She turned to face him fully. What is it? He hesitated, as if weighing the words. I was the one who told your husband, Thomas, about the spring, about the true value of the map. We spoke often in secret. He came to me, behind the other settlers' backs. He said he wanted a real peace, a safe place to raise his children alongside my people. Takakota's voice was heavy with old grief. I believed him. I trusted him. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Takakota looked down at his hands. If I had not told him, if I had not put that knowledge in his head, he might still be alive. Amelia looked at his pained face for a long, quiet moment. Then she reached out and took his hand in hers. He died believing that this place could be beautiful, Takakota, she said, her voice gentle but firm. He died trying to build a bridge. You didn't betray him. You gave him hope. He looked up at her, his throat tight with emotion, his eyes glistening in the firelight. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a simple, profound gesture of trust and belonging. And you gave it to me, too. The fire cracked and sparked between them, a beacon of warmth and life in the vast darkness, and above them, the stars stretched out across the endless sky, silent witnesses to a wounded land that was finally getting a chance to heal. Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but with a shy, tentative grace. Delicate blue and yellow blossoms pushed through the earth, and the breeze that whispered through the valley no longer cut like a knife. The land had changed, but not just from the melting snow or the new graves marked by river stones. It had changed because something fragile and impossible had been planted here. Hope. Amelia stood in the open field where the final bloody battle had taken place. New grass, vibrant and green, now grew where blood had once stained the soil. Her twins, Daniel and Ruth, now steady on their feet, toddled nearby, their delighted giggles rising like music as they chased a monarch butterfly through the air. A short distance away, Takakota sat on a fallen log, carving a piece of cedar wood. The beginnings of a flute were taking shape under his skilled hands. He still walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a permanent reminder of that night on the ridge, but the heavy weight he once carried in his eyes was gone. The grief for his brother hadn't vanished. It never would, but it had transformed. It was no longer a ghost that haunted him, but a fire that fueled him, a fire tempered by a hard-won peace. The valley was breathing again. The land was being shared, not in hollow speeches or signed papers, but in tangible, real ways. Water rights were agreed upon. Hunting zones were established. A trading post had been built where both Comanche and settlers bartered goods. Hands were extended where guns had once been pointed. It wasn't perfect. Old prejudices died hard, and resentment still flickered in the dark like dying embers. But it was real. It was a start. Amelia walked over to Takakota and sat beside him. He didn't look up from his carving, but he reached into his pocket and handed her a small wooden pendant he had finished the day before. It was carved into the intricate shape of a hawk in mid-flight. "For you," he said simply. She turned it over and over in her palm, the wood smooth and warm against her skin. "What does it mean?" His eyes finally lifted from his work and met hers. They were clear and steady. "It means you survived the storm," he said, "and now you are ready to fly." She smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, and then grew quiet. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "What would have happened if your horse hadn't brought you to my cabin that day?" He glanced at her, a slow, considering look. "Then I would have died in that storm, just as you would have," he answered without hesitation. "My exile had hollowed me out. I was just waiting for the end." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the tall pines. I still dream about Thomas sometimes, she admitted quietly, the confession feeling safe with him. He's never angry. He's just watching, as if he's waiting to see what I do next. Takakota nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He set down his flute and his carving knife. Then we must make him proud. She exhaled a long, slow breath and leaned her head against his strong shoulder. I think, she said, a sense of profound peace settling over her. We already have. 1 year later, a small schoolhouse stood near the river, its walls built from logs cut and raised by both settler and Comanche hands. The walls were painted, inside and out, with a beautiful, chaotic mix of symbols, English letters and numbers alongside Comanche pictographs depicting stories of the hunt and the spirits of the land. Children ran laughing in the yard, their shouts a mix of 2 languages, their games a blend of 2 cultures. They didn't think twice about the color of their friend's skin or the names of their gods. They were simply children of the valley. Inside, Amelia taught reading and writing. Takakota taught the old ways, how to track, how to read the clouds, how to listen to the language of the land and see the stories that others missed. It was a life neither of them had ever planned, a life that had grown from the ashes of fire and loss. And it was theirs. One sweltering afternoon, a rider appeared from the east. He was a stranger, his horse and clothes covered in a thick layer of dust. He wore a crisp gray uniform, the kind she hadn't seen since Virginia, and he carried a leather satchel bearing an official-looking seal. There was a hard, questioning look in his eyes. He asked for Amelia Cartwright by name. He handed her a thick, sealed envelope. She opened it slowly, her fingers suddenly cold. She read the letter in silence, her expression hardening. Then she read it again, just to be sure. Takakota, who had been watching from the doorway of the schoolhouse, saw the shift in her face. He saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes narrowed into familiar slits of cold fury. He walked over to her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She handed him the letter without a word. It was from a powerful law firm in Kansas City, representing the Transcontinental Railway Company. The land that Thomas had once claimed, the land whose map had been burned, was being disputed again. A geological survey team, they wrote, had found significant mineralogical deposits, oil, deep beneath the valley floor. The map may have turned to ash, but the whispers of its contents had survived, carried on the wind to stir the greedy hearts of powerful men. Someone in the valley, one of their own, had betrayed them. Again. Takakota folded the letter carefully and looked at her, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "They will not stop," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Amelia agreed, her voice dangerously calm. Her eyes looked past him, toward the distant eastern horizon. "They won't." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you want to run?" Amelia's expression was as fierce and unyielding as the mountains that framed their home. "No," she said. "I want to end it." A slow, hard smile spread across Takakota's face, the smile of a warrior who has found his cause. "Then we ride at dawn." The sun sank below the western peaks, painting the valley in strokes of fiery gold and deep crimson. The twins sat by the evening fire, their small faces rapt as they listened to Takakota play the cedar flute he had carved. The notes were high and haunting, a melody that spoke of sorrow, resilience, and the wild, untamable spirit of the land itself. Amelia packed a leather satchel, her movements precise and efficient. She packed dried meat, fresh water, extra ammunition for the rifle. She packed the new shared map of their home. And at the very bottom, she placed the small wooden hawk pendant he had carved for her. As she stood ready to leave, she turned and looked back one last time at the peaceful valley, at the schoolhouse, at her children. "Do you think it ever truly ends?" she asked softly. "The fighting." Takakota lowered his flute and looked at her, the firelight dancing in his dark, intense eyes. No, he said, his voice quiet but certain. But some storms you ride through, and others you become. She smiled, her heart full and heavy all at once. She was no longer the frightened woman in the cabin. She was the storm. And as they disappeared into the growing dusk, two shadows on horseback riding east, the valley watched them go. Because some stories don't end. They echo, and somewhere in the distance, a new chapter, forged in steel and steam and greed, was waiting to be written. If you were moved by Amelia's journey from survivor to warrior, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You have no idea what's coming next, and I have to ask, if you were in her shoes, would you have burned the map? Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching.